Disney may be behind some of the greatest animated movies of all time, but that doesn't mean all of its creations are 100% original.
Yeah!
Did you know the studio has copied other films more than once while creating its own stories?
You were gone forever.
It was 3 days.
One of the most famous and controversial cases of Disney plagiarism involves what's arguably one of its biggest classics, The Lion King. That movie is undeniably a masterpiece. Do you know anyone who watched it and didn't like it? Probably not, right? That's pretty impressive, considering almost everything in this world has its haters. The only version of The Lion King that gets some hate is the 2019 remake, which has a hyper-realistic style. But even though the original film is amazing, it's been accused of plagiarism ever since it premiered back in 1994. Why? Because it has some very suspicious similarities to Kimba, a Japanese animation from the 1960s. Both stories take place in Africa and center around lions fighting for their right to become king after the death of their fathers. Not to mention both feature nearly identical scenes of the main character standing on top of a mountain. Disney has denied the plagiarism accusations multiple times and even claimed that none of the animators involved in making The Lion King had ever heard of the anime. However, that was later debunked by some of the animators themselves, mainly because Kimba is a well-known work by Osamu Tezuka, an even more famous Japanese artist. It would be nearly impossible for no one on the Lion King team to have known about it. That would be like a professional fighter not knowing who Mike Tyson is, so it's much more likely that there was at least some unintentional inspiration. Even though the studio was never sued or admitted to copying, most people who know this story agree that The Lion King was heavily influenced by Kimba. And believe it or not, this is far from the only time Disney copied someone else's work. So grab your snacks and get comfy, it's time for another Cinewave. If The Lion King is one of Disney's old-school classics, then Inside Out is definitely a modern one, especially after the sequel became a massive box office and critical hit. But guess what? The idea behind the movie isn't entirely original, since another project had already explored the concept of our minds being run by tiny creatures. It was called Brain Divided. To be more specific, it's a short film that's only 5 minutes long and tells the story of a man on a date whose mind is controlled by two beings, one representing logic and the other emotion. Basically, it's like a stripped-down version of the Pixar movie that came out years later in 2015. It's not hard to imagine someone at Disney saw that short and thought it had the potential to become a much bigger and more complex story, with way more characters living inside people's heads instead of just a duo. Even though Inside Out was clearly inspired by the short, we've got to admit Disney did a great job developing the concept into something deeper. As surprising as it may sound, Disney's alleged copies aren't limited to films. Finding Nemo came out in 2003, and guess what was released a year earlier? A book called Pierrot, which features a clownfish that looks a lot like Nemo. Now, if you're thinking the book was rushed out just to hide the hype of Disney's upcoming release, think again. The author, Frank Lee Calvez, had come up with the idea for Pierrot years earlier and originally wanted to turn it into a movie. He pitched it to several French animation studios, but every single one rejected the idea. Only after that did he decide to adapt the story into a book, which is way easier and cheaper to produce than a film, believe it or not. It's a huge coincidence that Disney came out with a clownfish movie right after that, especially since Frank Lee Calvez claims other characters in Finding Nemo closely resemble the ones in his story. Could Disney have had contacts in French studios who leaked the Pierrot concept? We'll never really know. In fact, the author even tried to sue Disney and get all Finding Nemo merchandise pulled off the market. As you can probably guess, the case didn't go anywhere, and Disney is still making tons of money from its underwater classic. WALL-E is awesome. If you've skipped it because it's kind of an older movie now, you're seriously missing out on one of Disney's best. Beyond its heartwarming story, one of the coolest things about the film is WALL-E's design. But what if we told you that look was actually borrowed from an even older movie? Short Circuit is a 1980s sci-fi flick about a robot who, just like WALL-E, ends up developing self-awareness. The two characters look a lot alike, which led a lot of people to ask Andrew Stanton, the animator who designed WALL-E, whether he copied Short Circuit. Stanton denied it, saying his character was inspired by other things, like the lamp that shows up in Pixar's opening logo, and even a pair of binoculars. But he did admit that he had seen Short Circuit in the past and might have drawn influence from it without even realizing, though he insists there was never any intention to copy it. So maybe we can just call this one a tribute, right? At the end of the day, all of our favorite movies have drawn some inspiration from earlier works in one way or another. If you agree, drop a hashtag inspired down below. Here's another well-known case of alleged plagiarism, this time between Disney's A Bug Life and DreamWorks' Ants. Both movies are about ants who decide to challenge the rigid insect societies they live in. And here's the weirdest part, both were released in 1998, just 1 month apart. Ants came out first, which makes it seem like Disney shamelessly copied DreamWorks, right? Well, the truth is a bit more complicated. We have to remember that one of the founders of DreamWorks, Jeffrey Katzenberg, used to work at Disney. He left the company after facing some unfair treatment. And as far as we know, the idea for A Bug's Life was already floating around at Disney before Jeffrey left to start his own studio. So it's highly likely he knew Disney was working on that movie and decided to develop his own version. In other words, there's a pretty good chance it was DreamWorks that actually copied Disney. And the production of Ants was rushed so it could be released the same year as A Bug's Life. Jeffrey Katzenberg really seems set on getting back at his old bosses. To this day, fans are still split on which movie is better. The funniest part? Ants and A Bug's Life were the second and third fully computer-animated films ever made, Toy Story being the first. So for a brief moment in history, 2/3 of all 3D animated films were about ants. By now, it's pretty clear that Disney isn't the only studio accused of copying. DreamWorks has done its fair share of copying too. But DreamWorks has also been copied, and that happened when Netflix released The Sea Beast. The story is about a young boy living in a world where humans are enemies of sea monsters, until he befriends one of the creatures and realizes that both species can actually live and work together. If you've seen How to Train Your Dragon, you've probably noticed that the only difference is that one has sea beasts and the other has dragons. Other than that, the two movies are extremely similar. Not every case of copying involves an entire film. Sometimes it's just a specific scene, maybe because it's super iconic and Disney has figured no one would notice, or maybe because it's meant to be a little tribute for movie buffs to catch. In Toy Story 3, there's a scene where Woody falls and narrowly avoids crashing into the ground because he gets caught by a cord. This is a very obvious nod to the most famous scene in Mission Impossible, the massive action franchise starring Tom Cruise. If you didn't recognize it, the original scene is the one where Ethan Hunt is breaking into a secure facility with a rope strapped to his back and almost hits the floor, just like Woody. Another single scene homage shows up in Finding Nemo when Bruce, the vegetarian and totally chill shark, loses control and turns into an unstoppable monster, chasing the other characters in a frenzy. This moment is very similar to a chase scene in The Shining where the father, driven mad by the curse of the hotel, begins hunting down his own family. If there's one franchise that loves throwing in pop culture references, it's Shrek from DreamWorks. And one of those moments is when Fiona's wedding ring is flying through the air and lands perfectly on Shrek's finger. That's a clear nod to The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, where the One Ring, a dangerously powerful artifact, falls onto Frodo's finger in exactly the same way. And in Tangled, there's a reference so subtle that most younger viewers probably missed it. Flynn Rider, aka Eugene Fitzherbert, spends most of the movie using Rapunzel's frying pan as a weapon, and he grows so attached to it that he runs back to grab it just before a giant rock comes crashing down. We would say he loves that frying pan as much as Indiana Jones loves his hat, because he does the exact same thing in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Pretty awesome, right? If you want to keep discovering more cool stuff about the world of animation, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. That way you'll always catch our latest videos about your favorite cartoons. Remember that scene in the first Incredibles movie where Frozone gets stopped by the police? It's an awesome moment, and it gets even better when you find out it's actually based on a scene from Die Hard with a Vengeance. That's Die Hard 3. Want to know why? It's simple. Both Frozone and the character in the original Die Hard scene are played by Samuel L. Jackson, the same guy you've definitely seen in a bunch of movies. A reference just as subtle pops up in Monsters, Inc. during that slow-motion scene where the characters walk in formation like total legends. That's a copy of the iconic moment from Armageddon when a group of unlikely heroes is brought together to destroy an asteroid headed straight for Earth, and they walk the exact same way as they approach the spacecraft. Hercules, Disney's movie about the legendary Greek demigod, might have slipped under the radar for some people over the years, but it's still an absolute classic. And one of the best scenes in it is Hercules' training montage. If you guessed it was inspired by another movie, you'd be right. There's a moment where he's practicing a crane kick that looks exactly like the famous training scene from the first Karate Kid. Want to keep the fun going? Just click on one of the 2 videos we left on your screen. Thanks for watching. See you next time!